Hello, welcome to the fifth session of our Data Science for Social Good course. And in this session, we will talk about best practices. The knowledge that we present here is derived from the use cases that you saw in the last session, as well as from the desk research and from our interviews which were conducted during the project. In the following minutes, we will have this agenda. First of all, we will talk about the definition of a Data for Good project. So based on the projects that we have seen so far, we would like to talk about the characteristics of a typical Data for Good project. Then, after the project is defined, we will talk about the requirements, so to say the skill set that you need in order to conduct a successful project. And as most of the projects are dealing with data within an organization, we provide a data maturity discussion, which helps you to categorize and to characterize the data that is available within the organization that you work with. And then we will spend some thoughts about how to find the right project partners and what are the characteristics of a typical Data for Good project itself. Then, after the project is characterized, we will present some best practices for the project scoping. As well, we will bring some typical Data for Good life cycle project. So here we will go through the project life cycle in order to provide information on each stage of this project itself. Then we will talk about best practices for running a project, and we will talk about ethical and legal concerns that you should have in mind before you work with NGOs or nonprofit organizations. As we deal with data, there are some GDPR issues that should be addressed before you start to work with the data. Then, after the project is done, we talk about the output that you should be aware of. So to say, how to define the deliverables of a successful project. Then we will give you some ideas about the organizational structure and about the necessity of a legal entity that helps you to answer questions of ethical and legal concerns. So let us start with the question, what qualifies a Data for Good project? So this qualification remarks are the result of our Data for Good community interviews, especially the interviews with our CorrelAid partners. So first of all, you have to divide the questions into two sub-questions. The first thing that you have to have in mind when it comes to a Data for Good project is what kind of partner are you working with? So here it is especially the legal form of a partner which is kind of important to qualify a Data for Good project. So is the financial situation of the partner a corporate situation, or is it a social organization or a non-beneficial situation the partner is in? So therefore, you have to ask yourself if you work with a corporate or if you work with a public organization. As well, the purpose of the partner must be aligned with the values of your own organization. So if you are a volunteer or work in a volunteer organization, please align your values that are predefined before you are in touch with partners. Please ask yourself if your values are in line with the partner. Then, when it comes to the project itself, there are certain factors that you should be aware of. The first thing is that projects should be win-win. And this win from the volunteer side is not monetarized or must not be monetarized, but it should be on an educational factor, which means, can your volunteers learn something from the project? So what is the benefit for the volunteers to work here? And again, it's not a monetary benefit, but it should be an ideal benefit for you as well. And then ask yourself, will this project that you are working on have a positive impact for the partner or for the society as a whole, or will it cause no harm? So these are the questions you should be aware of before you start a project. And then, especially relevant for data science or data-driven project, is the question of sustainability. This means, is the project sustainable for the partner? That is, you are working on a complex data science project. Is there any person on the other side, on the partner side, who is able to work with the results that you create? So this is what you have to ask yourself. And you have to ask yourself, what is the role of your project in the organization of the partner? So in the organizational structure of your partner. So do you develop an add-on, or do you develop a core product of what is of the core of the partner? So to say, do you help the partner to provide a product to the society, or do you basically support the partner? So these are the questions that you should ask yourself in order to characterize your project itself. So when it comes to the partner, let's take a deep dive into the question you should ask yourself. So first of all, let us talk about the legal form of a potential partner. So if your partner is a non-profit organization, then your characteristics of the partner can be tagged as non-profit, and therefore, especially in Germany, this legal form describes most of the projects that social volunteers work with. If there's no non-profit organization, you should ask about the foundations. So is there any potential partner depending on the financial resources? So are there any foundations behind the partner? Or is there a social entrepreneur? So is there any enterprise in the background of this partner? So in German forms, it's Gesellschaft mit beschränkter Haftung, for instance, that could be considered as a partner. Or if there is no entrepreneur, sometimes those volunteer works also support people who are pursuing a for good project on their own initiative. So a voluntary initiative supports another voluntary initiative. And this is basically also happening sometimes when you work or if you provide volunteer service to social organization. And the next question is the initiative non-official? Especially when you work in a political field, they are often initiatives. They are not organized in a legal form and are rather loose. However, you should be aware that you are working for such an initiative when it comes to your own values, for the alignment of your own values, especially in the field of politics. So these are basically some questions that might help you to characterize your potential partner. The next question is, do you work with political parties? So this is a question that each organization that offers voluntary service should ask themselves. So for instance, CorrelAid is a non-partisan organization and avoids working for political organizations or parties with political background. However, CorrelAid encourages ideas which can be connected to like-minded people and therefore can be discussed in this area. And this does not exclude politics. But here it is a like-minded people that are in focus and not their political background. So for discussion purpose, this political party idea is less restrictive than for the project itself. Another question that you should ask yourself is, do you want to work with academic institutions or with individuals? So the question here is, on which level do you want to locate your project? Sometimes it's possible to find collaborations with university professors, PhD students, or postdocs. However, you should have in mind that here the research is the main output that is expected from such a project, and the project impact itself should also be somehow connected to social impact. And another thing you should ask here is the financial situation of the academics, so the professors, the PhD student, the postdoc, a reason for this project? So do you help a PhD student to write his or her thesis, or are you working jointly with the academic peers to find a solution to a social issue or to a social project that is predefined for you? So another question, which is maybe a bit easier to answer, is how to work for profit companies. So if you're providing voluntary service for profit companies, be aware that this company does not seek for cheap employees. So therefore, CorrelAid, for instance, the German CorrelAid initiative does not engage in any projects for profit companies. Unless there are very special circumstances, if, for instance, the profit companies also wants to provide some social service or some social good project and is seeking for partners who know these projects better than the company itself. So these are basically the questions you should ask yourself about the legal form of the partner. So therefore, you should also be aware that normally costs will not be covered by the partners, especially when it comes to the compensation for your own working time. So all the costs that are linked with a meeting at the partner side, or like, for instance, a workshop, may be covered by the partner and do not have to be covered by the organization itself. So that means you don't get any money, but you don't have to pay any costs as well. So as a rule, CorrelAid's Data for Good projects do not incur any costs, apart from the cost for personal kickoff workshops, for instance. So here it might be the case that the data scientists get invited for a kickoff workshop, and that then the organization they are helping is paying the mobility costs and offering the workshop itself in their building, for instance. So, but when it comes to the delicate question, how much money you should charge, or is there a way to charge money for your projects, you should ask yourself, how many employees do you have? And how many employees does the organization have? Normally, like those non-profit organizations do have in Germany 10 to 15 full-time employees. If there are other circumstances, you should check with the core team if this non-profit organization is large enough in order to cover some costs that occur. And then this comes to the second, and then we come to the second question. Is the organization you're trying to help realistically able to pay someone for the work? Normal contracts could be like a working student contract, or external consultant contract that you get paid for several days you work for, or that you become an employee. If they are able to pay for the work, you should ask yourself, why don't they pay the money to some professionals? Why are they interested in working with you? And here there is a question you should be aware of. Is the organization simply looking for free labor or for some cheap project workers? And why don't they pay regular market prices for this service? So therefore, for instance, CorrelAid has the guideline that they don't want to replace paid work with their projects. And the next question is, in order to characterize the partner, is the question, could this project happen without the help of the volunteer work? Because most nonprofit organizations would deny this question, and therefore it's important to stay critical. Yeah, because if you ask an organization this question, of course they will deny it. However, you in your internal circle of the organization who provides the voluntary work should be critical with the categorization of the organization. The next thing is the purpose. So is the organization you're working with aligned with your own values? As we already talked about politics, you should ask yourself, is a political party aligned with your values? Or can the project do some harm for society if your outcome might get into the wrong hands, or if political parties shift their focus, or due to election will lose or gain more impact in social topics. Therefore, be aware to critically scrutinize the individual values of your partner. This is linked with some research you should do beforehand in order to find out what your partner is doing. So, and this can be done by checking their homepage or social media accounts, or by some initial interviews with the partner itself. So then, after you've checked your partner, it comes to the characteristics of the project itself. And there the main question is, what's a good data for good project? Or in our case, as we derive this knowledge from CorrelAid interviews and also from the documents which are available, we were presenting the perspective from CorrelAid here. So the question is, when shouldn't we do a project? And here, the main goal is that the data for good project is beneficial for both parties. So this means it should be a win-win situation, but not in monetary terms. Here, the volunteers should be able to apply and expand their knowledge and skills. So as we said in previous sessions, the background of the volunteers is kind of heterogeneous, and so is the utility function of each volunteer as well. So try to ensure that the volunteers can be able to apply knowledge and skills, to network with each other, and to benefit from this project that they are working on. If it becomes apparent that, for instance, during the initial phase of the project, that the project is extremely one-sided, so for instance, if the initial project workshop gives you the feeling that the partner has strict expectations and does not want to generate this win-win situation so that you also benefit from this project, you should think about politely declining this project. As you work voluntarily, you should also put your position on stage and ask for such a win-win situation. In order to give you some example of bias projects, you can think about a project that would only be of interest to the volunteers, but not a real positive benefit for the nonprofit organization. So the shift of win-win can be one-sided, but not only for the partner, but also for the volunteers. The opposite is that the partner is looking for free work that is rewarding in any way, and therefore is looking for volunteers because the partner is not willing to pay for that. Therefore, each project should provide the opportunity to apply and learn useful data science skills. And data science is not a narrow term so that you should do programming or should work on artificial intelligence. Data science begins with the scoping of a project, with data exploration and feature generation, so to say, to collect innovative data. Therefore, be aware that those characteristics are met and that the volunteers can squeeze something out of the project for themselves, as well that the project partner benefits from this work. And this will be an ideal project itself. So therefore, it is the educational factor which is important for the volunteers. And if you find a project with a lot of data cleaning and a little bit of data visualization boring, it can be very good learning experience for the less experienced data scientists. This means if the project seems to be a non-advanced project where you have to collect data, where you have to do the data cleansing, there can be a learning factor for volunteers that do not have the scientific background of computer science, for instance. As the volunteers have different backgrounds, there might be volunteers, for instance, coming from social science who want to learn more about data science and who would be happy to work with the basics of programming or do basic data science tasks. Also, there might be a computer scientist who wants to learn more about project management, for instance. So this person would be happy to work with the project scoping, to coordinate the project rather than doing the programming itself. So therefore, every project offers the opportunity to learn, and therefore it is a challenge for the organization, for the Data4Good organization, to find the right people for the right project. Another thing is, beside the educational factor, it is the for good factor and the ethical considerations. So the question you should ask yourself is, will the project positively impact and improve the work of the organization? So before you start to invest time and your own free time into a project, you should ask yourself, what is the impact of the project? What is the goal that you try to achieve? So if you help nonprofit organizations in order to gain more impact in their daily work by supporting their internal processes, then this would be the ideal project of the Data4Good initiative. The critical point is most nonprofit organizations are not at the stage yet that they have a clean data household that could be the basis for advanced data science projects. Therefore, be aware whenever you talk to nonprofit organizations, the first task you should do or you need to do is find the data and ask the organizations at which stage they collect the data they have. Also, internal process projects should also have for good factor. That means beyond learning about technologies, the project should also have a benefit, which means if you're conducting a project, be aware that the open source development is given. That means that you provide some knowledge to the society. This could be one aspect for internal projects. Another thing is, if you derive insights from open data to answer social questions, share it with the community. Make possible that the community can learn from your findings. So be aware that a proper knowledge management is a key success factor for the whole Data4Good initiatives. And this can also be done by creating data visualization and use cases to draw attention and to trigger the attention of data scientists themselves in order to create a wider field for data science, in order to attract more and more people to help social organizations and to get experience in the field of social data science. What are the ethical considerations of projects? So the first question is, will the project reinforce existing inequalities? This question should definitely answered with a no. If you're not sure, or if the project is not in line with your values, you should reject the project. The next thing is, and this is a kind of critical question you should ask yourself, if you develop technical solutions, will this technical solution make moral ethical decisions? And here there are two levels on this question. The first is a kind of direct answer. So will you have direct moral and ethical decisions? This should definitely be a no. And it is more tricky to answer this question if you develop a tool. Can this tool be misplaced if it is trained on different data in order to derive different decisions. So if you think about, for instance, a sentiment indicator for social media, this at a first step can be helpful for an organization in order to find out how services can be improved, how the opinion about the services is in social media. But what happens if a sentiment analysis tool falls into the hand of political parties, for instance, who want to find out how voters think about them? And then you should discuss these issues within your internal organization circuits. The next thing is it the project itself? Is it a technical data-driven solution in the best interest of the people, or is it a data-driven solution in the interest of just one person who is really pushing to solve this issue, or who has her or his own agenda, or is it a solution which is supported by the whole society, which is affected by this? And here you should clearly vote with a yes. If not, you should think about the project itself. And then another question, which is linked up to the GDPR, to data protection and data privacy issues: which kind of data will be the underlying, will comprise the underlying information of the project? So here you should be aware that if you're working with videos and photos of individuals, you should be careful because of data privacy issues. So you should be careful to avoid any breach in data privacy. The next related question is with the GDPR, is, does the organization have the permission of the data subjects to use and analyze the data? So before you touch any data or talk about data, make sure that the organization has the rights to provide this data, so that you are not catched or caught in a GDPR breach. And this also counts for the content of the data. Be aware that the content that we're working on is not sensitive. And if you need help in order to answer this, you should consult legal experts, and you should ask yourself, will the results be publicly available afterwards, or will you be able to publish your results as an open source result, for instance? So these are the questions you should be aware of when it comes to the data itself. And in order to discuss the sustainability of a project, you should be aware that if you invest your time in a project, that the project will continue after, or the results of the project will be continue after you left this organization. So this is basically a typical consultant task as well. Like, consultants work temporarily in companies based on projects, and when they leave, they have to ensure that this results and the efforts that were invested stay alive after the consultant left. So therefore, the general question is, what is the impact beyond the time the volunteer is available? So therefore, you should ask yourself before you start the project, who is hosting this project? Is there on the other side someone who is the person who gets the handover after the project is done? And this is linked with the educational aspect. Is there a person on the other side, so working in the social organization, that is able to apply the results that you are realizing, and that is able to understand what you are doing? So the person you can hand over the results. Therefore, to provide an example, if you're a nonprofit organization and approach a data scientist, for instance, and you have a need for dashboard to monitor internal processes, and the data scientists apply R Shiny to fit and evaluate existing data, you should ask yourself, are you able to host the data scientists? Are you able to work with the app or the programming language a data scientist works on? Or if you're not able with that, you should have the opportunity to contact people who might help you with that, beside the volunteer who created it. So these are the questions you should ask yourself if you're a nonprofit organization. And when it comes to the scope, you should ask yourself as a volunteer, is the scope of the project doable? Because as you work as a volunteer, you work in your free time. That means you have a limited amount of time available that you can offer to a social organization. Therefore, you need experienced people on board when it comes to the project scoping, who help you to find realistic scope and who help you with the expectation management on both sides. So I think it's quite clear that a volunteer cannot solve all technical issues an organization have. And therefore, the organization needs also help with the expectation management to be on the same page when it comes to the expectations of the project. What might help if there is a project that there is an experienced person from the volunteer side or from the organization side who is able to split one project into smaller sub-projects. As well, follow-up projects are also a solution to this issue. Normally, as a rule of thumb, the CorrelAid projects are characterized by the fact that they are time limited and they require a maximum commitment of 5 hours per week and should not last longer than 6 months. And this is a rule of thumb for both sides. So it's easy to communicate for internal purposes to find volunteers, and also when it comes to the acquisition of projects. So what is the role of the project partner in such an organization? Basically, the partner is in charge and the volunteers support the partner organizations. And what they can do is they can support them with data challenges. And the partner can define challenges that will impact the work of the partner. For instance, if you want to improve the internal processes of the partner, or you want to have data visualization of existing data, the partner might define the challenge for the volunteers to improve given processes or to improve data visualization of given data. So these are examples for typical challenges that can be conducted. So now, after we talked about the characteristics of a project, we would like to talk about the requirements for a successful project. So what do you need in order to start a successful project in the field of social data science? Here we refer to the Data Science for Social Good Summer Fellowship team and the information they provided to us. You find the full list of references at the end of the presentation. So when it comes to the requirements for a successful project, Data Science for Social Good defined 5 points that should be addressed. You need a solvable problem. You need also a challenging problem, an important problem with social aspect. You need a motivated and committed partner who is capable of understanding what you're doing there. And most importantly, you need appropriate relevant data. Because within a project, the data issue is the most time-consuming issue in your project that you should be aware of. Therefore, if data is available, that is the ideal case. But if not, be aware that data cleansing and data preparation takes most of the time of your project in general. So these 5 points altogether form the components of a successful project. So a solvable problem deals with the expectation of the partner. Therefore, you cannot solve the partner's whole digitalization problems as well as you shouldn't work on micro problems that can be solved within one day. So therefore, it is necessary in order to scope the project properly to find the right frame for a problem. Therefore, it is necessary to have talks before you start the projects typically within a workshop, to define problems and sub-problems and to clearly communicate what should be done within a project. The problem also should be challenging to the volunteers so that the learning curve is high. As we already talked about a win-win situation, it is the learning curve for the volunteers that is the relevant information for each of the individuals' utility functions. Therefore, find challenging problems and encourage teamwork and spawn creative solutions to help data scientists to develop strong skills in solving real-world problems. And here, the skills are not only programming skills and data science skills, they also belong to project management, expectation management, knowledge management, and presentation skills. Therefore, an important problem with social impact is that the volunteers work with limited resources, and that it should be aware that the limited resources are their free time, or is their free time, and within the free time, they tackle significant and impactful problems. Hence, projects should align with the partners' organizations and operational need and contribute to social welfare. The prioritization of the project that benefit larger number of people is done by the impact itself. So stronger impact leads to stronger priorities. What does it mean to have a motivated and capable, committed partner? So the partner should be aware that volunteers work in their free time. This means there must be work be done, or there must be the relevant support from the partner side in order to make the life of the volunteers easy. So this means information which are necessary must be provided by the partner. If the volunteers do have questions, the partner must be able to answer them or must ensure that the right person in the organization answer those questions. Also, partners should provide valuable insights and support data science for social good in developing the solutions. That means the partner should not only be available at the beginning and at the end of a project, but also in the middle to help the volunteers to create usable solutions and to avoid that the solution is not usable for the partner at the end of the project. Therefore, the partner should ensure that at least one person from the organization is in touch with the volunteers. The next issue deals with the data. So the partner must ensure that the data that the volunteers need is available, or at least that the volunteers do have access to the data sources the partner works on. As social organizations work most of the time with anonymized data or pseudonymized data, the partner must ensure that the GDPR is in line with the work of the data scientists. The next thing you should be aware of before you start the project, and that which is crucial in order to find a successful project, is the diversity of the projects. Normally, the social data science organizations do have a variety of projects to showcase. If you look at our platform, we try to collect the most striking showcases, and have in mind that due to the heterogeneity, due to the individual organization of every individual social data science organization, there exists a variety of individual showcases. And these showcases are there in order to inspire the organizations and also to share the knowledge within the society itself. So please ensure, if you work on social data science projects, that the results can also be presented as showcases. Also, after you left the project, you should make sure, or you should be able to continue working with the existing partner in order to control the impact of the project and in order to improve the project deliverables. This relationship is kind of strong criteria for successful sustainability, because from the organizational side of point of view, the volunteers change. As volunteers work in their free time changes, especially when the primary job gets more time consuming or when family issues arise. Therefore, it is the long-term relationship which should also be considered between the social organization and the nonprofit organization. So before you start your project, we thought about the characteristics and about the relevant question you should ask yourself. And now it comes to the data itself. As typically, data is the underlying resource of the data science project, you have to be aware of the quality of the data that is available in the social organizations. Therefore, the data maturity of the organization plays a crucial role for a successful project. And in the next slides, we try to provide some support in order to identify the data maturity of the beneficiary. So what we do here is we do measure the organization in terms of data availability, and you can assess the data maturity of the organization in order to identify the probability of a successful project. Therefore, most of the projects deal with a data consultancy to help organizations how to organize the data collection. And therefore, it is relevant to understand which kind of data is available at the organization already, how the data is collected, are there proper processes in charge, and how the organization is dealing with the data. So how to save, or where is the data stored, in which quality is the data available, is there a consistent concept of collecting the data, and is there a historical data available already. In order to characterize the existing data situation, there are two existing frameworks that help you to evaluate the data maturity. The first framework that we refer to is the data ORCAD. This is a publicly available data maturity framework. As well, we do have a data framework available from the DataScience4Good Foundation. You can find them under those links, and we will present them on the next slides. So these frameworks help you to build an idea of an organization's technological and data readiness. And you also are able to check with the senior data scientists if individual projects can be conducted based on the existing data source or not. So what does the data ORCAD mean by data before we come to the data maturity index of data ORCAD? So basically the term data subsumes everything that is linked to data, and the data maturity is the ability to improve and increase its use of data. With data ORCAD means that all types of information which are collected, stored, and analyzed by an organization are stored in the name of data. So what does information mean? Normally, social organizations do have information about people, clients, customers, or residents they serve to. Also, services used and activities participated in are subsumed under the word data. As well, financial information, just as costs, income, grants, and so on, belong to the field of data. Also, employees and volunteer data and outcomes and impact measures belongs to data. So this is maybe a bit more abstract, but however, if you conduct a project, you should be aware of some KPIs, how to measure the impact of your project. And as we already discussed in the previous session, there's the field of external data. So if the data maturity of the internal data is not sufficient enough in order to conduct a project, social data science projects mainly focus on data consultancy to help the organization to make the data available and to screen external data, to overcome the shortages of internal data in order to find proxies for internal explanatory variables that can be used in order to find data-driven solutions for the organization. And then after you know what is subsumed under the name data, the maturity framework helps you to find or to evaluate the situation, the data situation that you will find within an organization. It is basically a structure that helps you to categorize the data within an organization. Most of the frameworks, like the one from DataOrchid, is used to promote best practice and ultimately serve the purpose of learning and improvement. So after you conduct such a maturity test, you know at which stage of data your organization is in. And here we would like to provide an example of the data maturity framework. The data maturity framework separates the data into 7 key themes: the users, the data, the analysis, the leadership, the culture, the tools, and the skills. So if you go through those 7 key themes, you will find the area in which data plays a role. So users means in which way does the organization use data already? Data means data itself, in which format, in which quality is data available. The analysis points at the analytics. So are there any analytics already in place? Does the organization work with diagrams? Does the organization already work with intelligent summarizations of existing data? Then there's the leadership. So is there any strategy in line? Is there any person in charge of the data itself or about working with data? So is there any person in the organization who is aware of the data? And then there is a culture. So what is the data culture? So are all the people working in the organization are aware of the data collection process, or is there no culture of data itself? And then the tools. So which tools are applied in order to work with data? And what about the skill set? So are the people who work in this organization are trained to work with data? And all those 7 themes are categorized into 5 different maturity stages. The initial stage is unaware, and the last stage is mastering. So this will be the ideal case. And in reality, it is something in the middle. So emerging, learning, or developing stage. And the maturity framework helps you in order to categorize the existing data framework into those 5 maturity steps and those 7 themes. So here you will find a summary in what I already said, and you will find the maturity framework at this link. So what DataOrchid also offers is a data maturity assessment tool. This tool measures the maturity of your organization. So it's not only the data, but it's also your organization that can be assessed. And here it is free to use for small organizations or individuals. And if you're a larger organization, you can also apply this, but then you have to pay for that. And we have to say that it's not only the focus on data. ORCID also offers you to evaluate a data strategy, for instance, to assess a given strategy within the data science framework. So this is basically what the DataOrchid wants. And then there's also the data maturity framework from DSSG Foundation. And here you can also see where you are and how you can improve your organizational, technical, and data-related readiness. And in contrast to the ORCAD, data ORCAD framework, the data maturity framework of data science for social good relies on three content areas, which is namely problem definition, data and technology readiness, and organizational readiness. The data maturity framework consists then of a questionnaire, of a readiness matrix, and an organizational readiness matrix. And all those materials can be downloaded here. So after we talked about the readiness, data readiness, and after you get a picture about what kind of data is in the organization, we can talk about how to find the right project partner itself. So this information is derived by the Data Science for Social Good Summer Fellowship team, and it starts as follows. So finding the right partner is basically a crucial task. And as most of the organizations are kind of individually organized, partners are also individually acquired. Therefore, if you're an NGO or an intergovernmental organization, you can partner with all those organizations. And here we have to separate between the university affiliated program, like Data for Social Good Summer Fellowships. Here, the organizations are in touch with the university and provide use cases that are analyzed within a summer school. But there's also the chance to be in touch with the organizations, the volunteer organizations that are spread all over Europe and that comprise volunteers that work in their free time all over the year. And here, if you're an NGO, you can contact the CorrelAid, Data Science for Social Good Berlin or Portugal, or any other existing Data Science for Social Good organization, and you will find an overview at our platform at the European map. But be aware that there are many data scientists out there who are happy to invest their time to help good causes. So if you're interested in the team itself that comes to your organization, or if you are a volunteer and you're interested in what kind of team you might work, we here provide some idea about the teams you can work with. So the characteristics of a typical Data for Good project teams have two goals. Normally, the first goal is to improve the operations of the partner, and the second goal is the education of an aspiring data scientist. And just to give you an example of the teams or the structure of a team, a typical Data Science for Social Good summer fellowship team, so those that work in those summer schools at university, they include one project manager, one senior technical mentor, and 3 to 4 data scientists. So this is basically a classical project hierarchy. At university, you do have the senior technical mentor that helps the students, the junior data scientists, with the issues, but who also enables them to solve the problem at their own. And here we have the situation that typically the projects itself are pre-screened by the project managers and the senior technical mentor. So the framing of the project has already been done when the junior data scientists work on that. Despite the university, we do have the Data Science for Social Good chapters and CorrelAid, like those initiatives. And here we do have different statistics, but in generally, both of them are comparable. Normally, you also do have a project lead who is in touch with the organization, and you have a team comprising between 2 and 8 data scientists, or in the DSSG chapters, on average 5. Normally, the hierarchies are kind of flat, and the background of those data scientists is kind of different. So depending on the area you are living, or what we found out, depending on the area these organizations are located. For instance, you might have teams comprising only social scientists that want to learn more about data science, or you might have a chapter that comprises more computer scientists who are happy to gain more knowledge in project management. But these are basically the descriptive statistics. Then the teams work in different styles. The classic volunteer-based project might feature so-called hackathons. So if you have a data set and a predefined research question or a problem statement, then the chapters or the organizations gather themselves for, let's say, a weekend or a week and initiate hackathons. That means all volunteers who have time might work on the data, and then you have this swarm intelligence that you have a fruitful environment where people talk to each other, discuss the results, and come out with the optimal result within a given time or very short period of time. Most of the data for good projects, however, required significant time dedication. That means that the projects that are conducted not within a hackathon normally endure 4 up to 6 months. So, and when it comes then to the project scoping, so to say before you start your hackathon or your project, you have to have several points in mind. The project scoping is basically a crucial task because this not only includes the organization of the project, also the expectation management for the other side. And normally, the estimate for a project scoping should last up to 4 weeks. And throughout the scoping phase, you have to discuss with a nonprofit organization several issues. The first thing is you have to discuss the project content and scope together with a nonprofit organization so that the expectations from both sides are clear what to expect. Also, you have to discuss what are the deliverables. So in which format does the nonprofit organization want the project to be handed over? Also, you have to discuss the data security issues. If you work with data, you have to be aware that the data security is your main concern or should be your main concern. And you should talk about a realistic timeline and about the team size and the composition from your side. And then during the project, you have to ensure that there's an ongoing dialogue with the nonprofit organization. That means you have to ensure that there is a person who is in contact with you in order to ensure that your outcome is always aligned with the expectations of the organization. A typical project requires 2 to 4 iterations over 1 to 4 weeks to finalize the project. Also, the contact does not have to be personally all the time. It might be via email, phone, or video calls. However, both sides agree on. From our perspective and what we found out from the interviews, it is necessary to have at least one personal conversation, especially at the beginning, in order to scope the project. And then it is also relevant for the success of your project. You should not share too early the scoping process, and you should create a shared record of plans and ideas. If you collaborate with a nonprofit organization, you have to define the project aspects and you need to explore the voluntary support opportunities. If you are in doubt of the ethics, there are several questionnaires that you can go through. For instance, CorrelAid publishes the ethic questionnaire that helps you to identify the relevant question and which helps you to check if you have an adequate answer to all the questions that are relevant in order to conduct an ethically correct project. If you apply the data maturity framework that was presented some slides ago, it helps you to understand the other side, the organization, so the situation the organization is in there. And then, based on those 2 questionnaires, you should focus on the organization's need. Also have to allow for flexibility for goal adjustments. So you have to do it in an agile project way. This is the reason why it is so important to be in touch with the organization all the time so that you can adjust your goals during the project if you have sub results which might be interesting. And if you describe all the results that you're working on, please avoid excessive technical details. When it comes to the expectation management, you should always make clear that your projects are voluntarily driven. That means you do not work full time, you work 3 to 5 hours per week on average. The next thing is, as you're dealing with volunteers who are all in different personal situations, let's say they are students or professionals at the early stage, there might be situations that some individuals withdraw from the project. Therefore, you always have to ensure that there's a proper knowledge management and documentation of the results in place, which also stops you from being quick in a project. So be aware of this issue. And also, what the initiatives always underline or need to underline, they are not a service provider. So if timelines are not guaranteed or cannot be guaranteed, the other side has to live with that. Yes, like the nonprofit organization does not pay any money for the service. Therefore, the volunteers are able to define the timeline that fits to their lifestyle and to their professional work life. And if there are deadlines required, the organization should think about hiring paid freelancers and not working with volunteers itself. And as we already discussed with the individual utility function of the volunteers, you have to be aware of that the project should benefit both the nonprofit organization and the volunteers. When it comes to the data privacy and the access of the data, you have to be in touch with the organization, and the organization has to make clear that you are allowed to work with the data. That means if personal data is involved in the project, the organization has to make sure that this data is free to work with, or that this data is pseudonymized or anonymized so that you are allowed to work with this information. However, you as a volunteer should not only rely on this information from the organization, you should also make your own thoughts about this topic, especially in case of any doubt. Be aware that you work with data and you are the one who touches the data. Therefore, you should also check if data privacy protocols are necessary and if you deal with delicate data. If there's no personal data, the data protection measures depend on the nonprofit organization's preferences. The key questions you should ask yourself is local encryption needed? So is there an official laptop from the nonprofit organization that you should use, or are you allowed to use your own laptop? And how do you have to encrypt the data that you work with? And the next question is, because if you are a volunteer, you are interested in showing your work, in providing showcases to the society or to your peer group, you should make sure or ask if your GitHub repository is sufficient for data storage. And if not, if the nonprofit organization is allowed to give you service or some space that is secure from the point of view of the organization. And here, be aware that the initiatives like CorrelAid or DataScience4Good do not work as a host. And here, a common solution are private GitHub repositories, where you can restrict the access to authorized team members and allow for collaboration within the guidelines of GDPR. So therefore, the GitHub repository is the open source open source SharePoint in order to provide the knowledge to your peer group, but you can also restrict the access privately, and you should align this typical data storage with the organization itself. And also, which also belongs to the services of social data science, is to assist the nonprofit organization to choose the appropriate licenses. And there, make sure that you assist the nonprofit organization rather than to provide the full service. If you are involved in such a topic, please use open source resources like choosealliances.com. And here is one critical remark: as it is a sensitive topic, get always written confirmation from the nonprofit organization. Avoid oral consents, because if you are dealing with data and delicate GDPR questions, you need written information from your nonprofit organization. So, and here is an example of a table that you could apply or should apply when it comes to the data project scoping. And these are the questions you should go through with your nonprofit organization and also internally. So the question that you should ask is, can the data be stored unencrypted in the local machines? Or can the data be stored unencrypted on the local machines? Are not allowed, then your team members need an encryption. And here it's VeraCrypt is a common encryption tool to apply. Then you should ask if the data can be uploaded to a GitHub repository. If not, you should use particular cloud solutions in line with the nonprofit organization. And then the next question is, if the data cannot be uploaded, can the code be uploaded and published? Because this is basically the asset that you're working on, and this is basically the relevant information that is shareable for the society and other data scientists might be interested in. For a timeline, we do have this example here. So it is essential to agree on a common timeline. Although you're working voluntarily, the organization also needs some timeline they can rely on. And therefore, here is an example of a typical timeline of a Data for Good project. It starts with the applications for the project, and then the call for applications to find volunteers for a project is done and collected. Afterwards, the team is selected, and then there is an onboarding and coordination kickoff, which means then the team gathers together and there's an onboarding. That means the person who initiated the project has to onboard all the other team members. And this is basically a critical challenge because as there are volunteers with different knowledge background, it is sometimes tough or challenging task to align all those different backgrounds to one point of view. And then there's a project workshop, the kickoff workshop, and then the project work starts. And depending on the dimension of the project, this project work is 1 to 6 months. Then there's a handover workshop and the final closing event. And for an ideal project, there's also a follow-up so that you do keep in touch with your project partner. So when it comes to scoping and the planning of the project, be aware that you include buffer time for holidays and disruptions, so that, for instance, sickness does not disturb your timeline. Align with the non-profit organization's timeline, so that you don't hand in a project when when the contact person is on holiday, for instance, and provide a clear project endpoint. So provide information about the project deliverables itself. Also, start projects in autumn or spring for better momentum. Summer projects may face vacation-related challenges. This is basically one of the learnings that we had from our interviews. And when it comes to the team composition, outline the desired team structure before calling for applications. So what kind of competences do you need? Do you need more advanced analytics, or do you need data engineering, or do you need data exploration skills? And then try to call for applications so that you are able to do the right stuffing for the project that you predefined. And then it is also to have more staff than too few. It is better to work with more people than less, because if one or two persons leave the project during the time, especially when the project lasts longer, it's better to have some backups. And the role is also a critical issue when you scope a project. There should be one project lead that coordinates the team and is the main contact for the nonprofit organization. Typically, this is done by the more experienced parts or more experienced data science. However, it is not always required. So it could also be for some project a person who wants to learn to be a coordinator, who is interested in working as a coordinator. And the team members itself or themselves, they can range from beginners to experienced data scientists or analysts. So here, depending on the project, on the heterogeneous content of the project, the background of the team members might differ. Also, you should also train non-experienced people and have always one or two team trainees on board that never conducted a project before, so that they can learn. So the team structure itself is one project team, 2 to 4 team members, and one team trainee. If you do the scoping itself, you have to define the scope. After the initial screening, iterative and refined throughout the project, this is the characteristic of the scope. Yeah, so the scoping could be agile, because depending on the information that you find in the organization, depending on the findings based on your data analysis, the scope might change in the one or other direction. Therefore, be aware that you allow yourself to change the scope within the project if necessary. So in order to have a proper scoping, and if you're not experienced in that, we have some questionnaire or some classical step process in order to find the right project scoping. Here, you start with the problem understanding. You try to understand what is the problem and how it can be solved. Based on this, how it can be solved and what are the challenges of this solution, you define the goals. So you try to find realistic goals, what can be achieved in a project with a limited amount of time with volunteers. Then you work on interactions, or you work on actions. So what actions do you need in order to make your project work? What data do you need in order to make your project work? And here, based on the data maturity, you might already screen the organization and ask yourself, what kind of data do you need? In which format do you need it? And do you have access to the relevant data? And if the data is not available internally, can you get it externally? Then in the fourth step, there is the analysis. So based on the data, you need to decide which analysis should be done in order to provide the questions that were raised in the problem understanding and in the goals section. So here you need to define what kind of analysis do you want to conduct. And then based on the ethical considerations, you should ask yourself, is the data privacy, transparency, and discrimination in line with the codex of your organization? And how will your project tackle ethical data considerations? And then the additional consideration that you have to have in mind is how will you deploy your analysis as a new system so that it can be updated and integrated in the organization's operations. This means how will you hand over the project and how will you ensure that the results are applicable in the organization that have to live with the results after the volunteers leave. So based on the scoping process, we would like to spend some thoughts on the iterative nature of scoping and the ethical integration into the scoping process. So first of all, you should be aware that the scoping is not a fixed point of the process. It is a rather iterative step. So at each project step or at each stage of the project, you should be able to reassess your scoping or to redefine it. Especially when you work with data, this means that you get more information during the whole process of the project, and therefore you should always challenge your scope at every stage of the project. Especially at the beginning, is the data that you planned available, or are the results derived from the existing data are in line with the assumptions of the initial scope of the project? And therefore, you should always give yourself the chance to restart this scoping process. And you should understand that each step of the project describes an opportunity to reassess the predefined project scope. The same holds true for the ethics. Ethics should not only be discussed at the very beginning of the project, they should always be integrated into every stage of the project and should be communicated to the non-profit organization as well. Because here is the same like with the scope. If you have data and you derive findings that were not in the scope or you did not expect beforehand, then you should be able to talk about ethics or to communicate issues related to the ethics internally and also with the stakeholders of the project. So having this in mind, you should be able to have a proper project scoping, and you learned about the most important task when it comes to the scoping of a project. If you wish for further information, here are the two main sources of this presentation, of this part. And here you will find a worksheet that helps you to tag the questions that we asked here and to gives you a guideline for your own project. As well, you will find the presentation dealing with data science project scoping, and the links are given here as well as on our homepage. So next, we would like to talk about the typical data for good project lifecycle. So after you did the scoping and you start with the project, there is a typical lifecycle for data for good projects. And this is basically a picture taken from DSSG Portugal. And here, this graph depicts the ideal case of a project. However, it is to say that every project is individually and heavily depends on the task that the team has to do and the period, as well as on the team constitution, plays also an important role. However, we try to provide a standard process for your orientation. So let us begin with the left-hand side. Here, there is the touch point between Data Science for Social Good Portugal, in this case, and the beneficiary. Together, they talk about the problem and they identify the problem that should be tackled in a project. This is done with an exploratory meeting where the beneficiary provides a data sample. So based on the initial discussions, the beneficiary has to provide a simple data sample. Here it is to say that it should not be the operative data, so that a regularly updated database of the beneficiary. It is enough to provide a small subset of this data. The important aspects are the format of the data and the quality of the data. Therefore, a small subset to provide a flavor for these two characteristics should be sufficient in order to let the volunteers do the project scoping. Yeah, and here in the project scoping, it is, as we already discussed, an iterative process between the beneficiary and the lead of the project team. After the scoping, the ethics committee from both sides should agree on a project, on the scope, and on the respective data and resources that will be addressed in the project. Also, it is necessary to talk about the project sponsors. And all this together forms a so-called formal agreement. So if it is a contract or simply an agreement, it depends on the form of the volunteers as well as on the nonprofit organization. But this sheet or this document, the sheet of paper or this document are the basis for the volunteers in order to formulate their call for volunteers. So based on the formal agreement, the initiative, like DSSG Portugal, starts looking or recruiting volunteers. So typically they are organized in an informal way via, for instance, a Slack channel or another chat group, and they call for volunteers and ask who has time and who has the capabilities that are needed in order to fulfill the formal agreement. Normally, 3 to 4 data scientists are needed. The more, the better. Then there's the team onboarding. So the person who is involved in the scoping tries to do the team onboarding to present the key challenges of the project and the expectations, as well as the defined deliverables. Then the project kickoff marks the beginning of the project. Normally, it is a workshop where the beneficiary and the team meet. And then the volunteers start to work, typically on average 3 till 6 months for the project. And here we do have an agile development. That means here we do have results, we do have different steps in the project, and each step deals as more information to reassess the scope of the project and to build the basis for the expectation management within the project. Therefore, in this loop, the beneficiaries should be somehow integrated and deal as a contact person in case of any questions. Then, after the project is completed, the work is not done, or the work is not done, because then, after the project completion, there will be a presentation to the beneficiary and a handover. And this handover is crucial because during the whole process of the project, there should be at least one person from the organization that takes care of the results and takes care that the results are properly implemented within the structure of the organization. So to say, when the volunteers leave, that the work will still be used or applied in the organization form. And then in the ideal world, after half a year, the organization such as DSSG contacts the beneficiary again and asks for an impact review. So they might ask, how do you use our results? Are our results implemented into the operational level? And maybe they might ask for some KPIs which were designed before the project start or agreed on. So this is basically the ideal case for a social data science project. And if you want to have more information here, then you can find it on the GitHub presentation of the DSSG Summer Fellowship. And here you'll find the whole curriculum where you can find more information on this workflow. And if you want to have more information on those typical projects, you will also find it on this Hitchhiker's Guide provided by the DSSG. So coming to the best practices for running a project, that means when the project starts, how to behave within a project. And here, the information we present are provided by both the DSSG organization as well as CorrelAid. So the best practices and resources is to produce a sheet that so an information sheet that all participants of the project can assess. The best thing is to create a GitHub. And then you should be able to be in touch with all the project members via this platform. So via this GitHub or via this shared folder. And within this folder, you should establish a list where you have all your tasks been documented, and where you can mark your tasks that are done with a definition of done. Then, after this is done, you should focus in your work to explain what are you doing here. Because if you have in mind that you're working with volunteers, and volunteers might come and leave while the project is ongoing, a proper documentation is the main advantage, for an onboarding process or to onboard new colleagues. Therefore, whenever you work, and in the data science project, it's most of the time it's a program code, you should focus on a proper code documentation. And within this documentation of the code, you should focus on the why. So why are you doing this? Why are you writing this kind of code? And you should include the how. So how this code is configured. Because this how is highly relevant for people who are not that skilled. So think about your code and think about, or your document, your output, and think about of handing over it to someone else without being in the room. And these questions the other person could have should be answered with your documentation. Another best practice for running a project based on programming and codes, so to say a data science project, is about data visualization and reporting. If you do the data visualization part, please apply essential reporting concepts. And then if you do the essential concepts, which are understandable by others, try to use libraries that are also accessible to others. If you, for instance, work with R, it should be the ggplot2 tutorial, or in Python, there's a tutorial for bars and box plots. So these are the two best practices if you work with one of the most common programming languages, and do always provide the libraries we are working with. The best practices for our projects in general are four different codes. You should, first of all, be available of the efficient file handling within your project. So this is meant by here. Yeah. Also, you should manage the packages, and you should maintain a consistent environment. This means if someone tries to replicate your results on his or her own PC, be available that the packages are mentioned and are available. So a good solution to that, for instance, would be a Docker container, so that all of the people who have access to the code can run it. Also, try to customize and enforce code styling for consistency, so that you have a consistent style of coding. And check your code quality via linting. More best practices are the organization of your files. Yeah, if you are more interested in this technical issue, please explore the best practices for structuring your R projects. And if you want to save your files, please use best practices in file naming. Yeah, and here you find links to the relevant pages. Also, when you're working with objects, try to find a consistent way of naming objects so that you have all over throughout different participants the same way of naming objects. So if more people work in one code, try to align the naming of the objects. And here is a so-called snake case in R, which is marked with a lowercase bar here, and the camel case in shiny. So these are so-called best practices you should be aware of, or you should take into account when it comes to joint programming within one document. So on the next slide, there's just a small graphic in order to provide some graphic about the best practices in coding to give you a feeling what it means if you apply the snake case or the camel case. So this basically this picture refers to the snake case that you link all words together with a lower underscore. The camel case means that you capitalize all following words, but you start with a lower capital. So that you here, instead of the snake case where you have underscores, you use capitalized letters in order to signal that there's a new word starting. However, if you're interested in this rather technical best practice, please feel free to use the CorrelAid docs that we are quoting here and at the end of the presentation. So the next remarks refer to R Markdown. In order to use R Markdown, you should ensure reproducibility and the version control. Yes, so if you use R Markdown documents, ensure that all of the volunteers are able to reproduce it. Especially with R, you will have this issue that there are ongoing updates going on for R, and the software that you might use or the packages. And therefore, it might occur that after a while, some codes will not run anymore because of updates. Therefore, you have to ensure reproducibility by version control. Also acceptable formats are Microsoft Word. However, be aware that these formats should be readable for your organization, for your beneficiary as well. Therefore, the most used output formats are PDF or HTML if you have interactive elements. If you are looking for the resources for the R Markdown, please use the beginner's guide or the development guide here, posted here. If you are into interactive dashboards, please use open source non-licensed applications so that the beneficiary does not have to pay for a license in order to see your product. So here are two. It's called Flex Dashboard. It's a simple and intuitive tool to create dashboards. And this is basically suitable for static or infrequently updated data. So it does not demand a high degree of interactivity. If you're aiming at a fully interactive dashboard, you should use R Shiny. However, this requires hosting the development until the local use is sufficient. So here you have to be aware that you need a host which has to be in line with the current GDPR guidelines. Also, the maintainability, the future support may be needed after project completion because Shiny is far more complex than the Flex dashboard. A combination of both is also possible. So when it comes to the ethical and legal concerns, what is a good way to deal with these concerns when interacting with data for good organizations or volunteers? The ethical and legal concerns are considered or are linked to the importance of personal data. And what you have to address is every concern from an ethical and legal perspective when you work with personal data. If you cannot manage your questions, then you have to stop the project. So if you are unsure whether you are allowed to work with the data or whether you are allowed to draw certain conclusion from a given data set, you have to ask your ethical and legal advisors or the team who is responsible for that in the organization from both sides, from the beneficiaries and from the social data scientists. And if you are unsure, you have to pause the project. In this vein, mature organizations like DSSG Portugal or CorrelAid, they do have committees dealing with ethics and GDPR questions related. Therefore, the larger the group, the better the help. And if you are a small group, please feel free to contact other organizations to ask for help. They are all volunteering and they all have the same goal. They are interested in project with social impact. Therefore, if you are not in the position to answer the question legally or from a GDPR perspective or ethical point of view, then you should stop the project and ask for help somewhere else. If you want to read more about the ethics, you can find the document provided by DSSG here and materials on ethics, bias, and fairness here. So CorrelAid also provides a document for volunteers about data security by containing the following information. First of all, the type of data, and second, the personal data. The definition of personal data says that it means that any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. An identifiable natural person is one who can be identified directly or indirectly, in particular by reference to an identifier such as a name, an identification number, location data, and so on. So here you have to be aware that you're not able to identify certain persons based on individual identifiers. And be aware, also the name or the address is not mentioned, you might have additional information that help you to identify a person, like, for instance, geocodes or coordinates of certain locations where the people move, like movement data. So be aware that this topic of specialized data is a delicate one from a data privacy perspective. If you have personal data and if you have the legal advice, you can work or you can try to anonymize the data. In the ideal world, you do already have the anonymized data so that they are out of the scope of the GDP and you can work with it. That means you can work with data where no identification of the individual that holds these parameters is possible. In contrast to anonymization, pseudonymization is another tool or another way to avoid the identification of a person. And this is basically another perspective on making data available by using a different way of altering the data at hand. So please distinguish between anonymization and pseudonymization before you apply it. But be aware that both concepts allow you to work with data. So if you have non-personal data, for instance, data on organizational processes and institutions which are confidential, make sure that you are allowed to work with the data. In your ideal project, the data is open data. So that means the data that you have is available for unrestricted use, and so is the information behind the data. Well, that means you're allowed to distribute the data, to share it with other volunteers, and to show it after the project is done and to create a use case out of it or a showcase. And then be aware that non-personal data is not subject to GDPR. And depending on the project, that all team members and organizations should sign a security declaration beforehand. So that means in order to provide transparency and clarity about the data that you're allowed to work with, before you start the project as a voluntary organization, you should sign a security declaration. We provide a link to the security declaration of CorrelAid. And what you should do is you should customize the declaration based on the specific project. As we said at the beginning, every project is individual, and so is the data and the scope of the project. And this is a task a project coordinator should communicate with the organization, with the nonprofit organization, and should make sure before the discussion about the project start that the data security declaration is under control. And then when it comes to the working with data, it's also an issue where the data is stored. And this must also be discussed. Because if you work with data and an organization provides you with data, with internal data, you must make sure where the data is stored. And if it is stored in a local machine or if it can be stored in a cloud service. And if you work with a cloud service, you should be aware that the cloud service might be somewhere else where different GDPR rules apply. For instance, if you use Microsoft or Google as a cloud, you should focus on the US American data privacy rules, and you are not in Europe anymore. So therefore, if you're working in Europe and you want to use a European GDPR, you should focus on European cloud providers. The next thing is about encryption. So you might secure the data by encrypting the user's home directory. And here is the app VeraCrypt. It's a program. And here you can create encrypted containers that require a password for decryption. So here you can store your data and secure it with a password. And this password is only handed over to all those volunteers that are screened by the organization. And this VeraCrypt is, from our point of view, one of the best practices that are quite helpful if you're working with data and are in a project where more people have to have access to the data. Because the advantage is that programs can access the encrypted data in memory, so you don't have to fill in the password all the time that you need the data. And the other thing is that you have to have in mind that the container size cannot be changed after creation. So at the very beginning, the manager of the project needs an idea about the required storage volume. If you have the encrypted home directory, you prevent unauthorized people access to the data. But the challenge is that there must be at least one person to have access in order to get the access. And if you think about the idea of voluntary work, where people are coming and going based on their private life circumstances or on their professional circumstances, you have to ensure that there's at least one authorized person who is able to have the login data. If you're interested into technical details, here we provide the links for different platforms for Windows, Mac, and Linux, and you can read more about VeraCrypt here. So at the end, what is a typical output for a project? Here, the typical deliverable of a project is a so-called prototype. So what normally teams do with a social organization is they develop prototypes, and this basically takes a duration up to 6 months. A prototype means after the prototype is done, it needs further development and testing, although the project is over. The interesting part is if the prototype is developed within a project, so it fulfills certain criteria of social data science, It might be used by the organization, and it also might be shared with the public or with the peer group via GitHub repository, so that then the working prototype based on a data sample might be further improved. Also, if you think about the handover of a deliverable, especially a technical prototype, the handover should be in combination or should be combined with a workshop and with a detailed explanation of the details that altogether build the prototype. So this means normally the code is handed over and the usage and a clear guidance of how to use the prototype. Because we have to have in mind that social organizations ask for help in the field of data science because they don't have the capacity for that. But they need the competences to deal with the result and to handle the results once the data science team is finished. The organizational structure, the typical organizational structure of a project is as follows. If we draw on DSSG Portugal, it is about the connection between volunteers and beneficiaries that are connected via a project. That means you do have a so-called lead team. You do have a lead team. And the lead team is responsible for the volunteer management, for the communication, for finding sponsors and partners that sponsor the full organization or are partnering the full organization and support them with stuff needed. And the beneficiary management. So they are in possession of an address book on the contact information of certain beneficiaries, and they do the acquisition. Once the beneficiary is identified, volunteers get in touch with the beneficiary via this project. So volunteer data scientists work on the project and are therefore in touch with the beneficiary. However, the beneficiary normally or typically is in touch with the organization itself with a so-called lead team. This is basically a best practice organization. So on the one hand, the beneficiary is able to work with the data scientists who work voluntarily and who changed by time. And the beneficiary is also in touch with the overall management, who has a certain degree of continuity and therefore allows the beneficiary to be in touch and to provide requests or call for problems or call for action with the beneficiary management. So therefore, the beneficiaries should be public, governmental, private, or non-profit institutions, and the focus lies on socially impactful projects. The management of the DSSG Portugal organization takes care that the problems to solve are clear and make sense and do have impact. They take into account data availability, and they take into account the collaboration, like the commitment to actively participate within the project and to ensure that the project is successful. Also, the DSSG Portugal contributions are that their utilization of resources through data is ensured and that they support data insights that can be measured and enhance the program impact. So this is basically the combination between the beneficiary and the DSSG Portugal. In Germany, we do have the CorrelAid. They are differently organized. They are organized as a German association. So you do have a general assembly, and you do have local chapters all over Germany. Those local chapters are marked with an X, and they form or build the network. The local project teams depend on the project and are not necessarily only from one chapter. So chapters might work together, especially when there's a hackathon where chapters might meet. But in general, you do have a general assembly, And you do have local chapters who work individually and who are in touch with each other, depending on the persons who work there. So the network itself has the goal that they project for civil societies in organizations. So that means that network members receive project announcement altogether and the information how to engage with CorrelAid. Then there is an annual Data for Good summit. So that means the entire network is invited for workshops, networking, and collaborations. This is how the network itself works. And the internal and the teams, the CorrelAid teams work in the internal way. They are organized internally to streamline decision making and structure activities. And each team includes projects, education, fundraising, and infrastructure. And each individual team should be the first point of contact for both for nonprofit organizations as well as for volunteers who are interested to do something good in their environment. In the core team, they're actively involved all members in the organization, and a dynamic, flexible team with around 20 members currently builds the basis or the core for whole Germany. There are bi-weekly calls, or most of the time Slack channels are used, and there is an annual strategy meeting. All those points together form the core team. The project teams are more heterogeneous and are more dynamic. That means due to the individual projects and project partners they face, they do have different structure, or the structure might differ by each team. That means the way they meet, the duration they meet, and the frequency they meet, and the dimension of the team might differ by each region. So after the project is done by one team, it's published within the full network so that the full network might benefit from the results. Then, when the projects begin, workflow and data security are trained, followed by a kickoff workshop. So all teams, although they deal with different projects, do have the same starting point. And just to give you a number, currently, so now we have 2024, CorrelAid manages up to 10 projects per year, with plans to increase this number to expand their impact. The board structure of CorrelAid is elected annually. So, and there is a conference, Data for Good, and here is where the board is elected, and there are 7 members that form the board. And the board members basically represent the continuity of the CorrelAid organization as a whole, and they're dedicated to guide the direction and development of CorrelAid. If you imagine, or if you think about current trends in data science reaching to artificial intelligence, the board members are typically those who define the strategy, how to deal with current development, and what is relevant for nonprofit organizations. The overall goal is the transparency within the network, and that experiences and best practices can be shared within a network of volunteers. And the board members are responsible to regularly update these standards. In order to communicate, the primary choice of all voluntary data scientists is Slack. Yeah, so they communicate via Slack because Slack allows them to chat with each other in an informal way. And they also do have weekly calls every Monday at 8 p.m. Where they meet all over Germany. The overall participation is voluntary, but it is crucial to stay informed within the network of CorrelAid. The Data for Good Summit, so the annual meeting where the board is elected, is on a weekend. And the goal is to do the networking, learning, and planning future projects. And here you do have a schedule, an exemplary schedule of the last event. And you see that we have a public event, data science workshops, and development workshops, open to all participants. Also, there is an annual retreat where the board meets and where the strategy is reflected and where upcoming internal projects are discussed. Last but not least, we would spend some thoughts on the necessity of legal entity. So as you can see, the CorrelAid network is quite large all over Germany, also in Europe. Now the question is, do they need the legal entity and how do they organize themselves? Normally, the volunteers operate without legal entity. However, you need a legal entity in order to, for instance, receive some benefits like donations or even to enter legal agreements if you work with data and you think about the data privacy. And as chapters grow, it may become necessary to establish a legal structure, especially if you work outside Germany. For instance, in Germany, CorrelAid does have a license agreement, but they also have a Dutch chapter, and the Dutch chapter chose to become its own foundation instead of operating under the German association due to legal and financial reasons. So that means every initiative has to decide, depending on their location and depending on their dimension, depending on the donations they receive, and depending on the project they want to tackle, in which legal entity they want to organize themselves. So here you will find the quoted literature, and the session is done.